slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Hi, and welcome to the 7th installment of the Dad Project. Glad to have you back, and tonight we will be heading out for a well-deserved vacation. Well, a working vacation for my dad and a folly for my mom, brother, and me as we all made our way for the port of Genoa in Italy, sans my sister. My dad had his berth on the carrier he was attached to, the USS Randolph, as it plied its way across the Atlantic, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and finally into the Mediterranean Sea. My mom, my brother Scott, and I would be on the same route, but being offered all the luxury and fine dining that could be found on an Italian coal ship, the Simonetta. In 1941, the book, The Army Wife, written by Nancy Shea, would be published. It would be a semi-official Army manual on how to be an Army wife. Before its publication, the Army had relied on senior Army wives to mentor the young women that married into the service. With the specter of war on the horizon and the thousands of new military wives it would generate, it was realized that the time-honored tradition of mentoring would be impossible. It would come down to an Army commander's dutiful request to Nancy Shea, the wife of Army Colonel Augustine Shea for 20 years, to write the unofficial guidebook for the present and future Army wife. The book was so well received that the Navy quickly sought their own manual for the Navy wife. And with the help of Anne Briscoe Pye, the Navy Wife was published in 1942. I mention this because of a clear memory of a well-worn copy of that volume on our bookshelf. For the most part, it is a relatively dry presentation and translation of an alien world that the military spouse was about to enter. It's hard to convey how alien this world really was and is. The book has home quips such as, "Don't worry, darlings, if you stand by while Pete and Ev are taking their flight training at the cradle of naval aviation, you will feel very definitely that you have earned your wings too." But then, more ominously, aviators are often temperamental, so be prepared to adjust your social and home life to your husband's vocation, she says. Add to that the deployment at sea that typically lasted for 6 months, and new orders with assignments every 3 years that usually required a move to another base somewhere in the U.S. and sometimes overseas. Tuck a hot conflict into that mix and the volatility only escalates. Sorry, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. In any case, what Nancy Shea was asked to do was to outline the military life with all its nuances. A book that outlined and defined the beast that is military life and offered advice on how to tame, stay, and or ignore that beast for a spouse ignorant of the sacrifices they would be asked to make on the home front. So what was our home front? This wouldn't be the home front that the British endured in World War I, and far from the home front the Americans endured in World War II. No, ours was the home front of a peacetime Navy on war footing in the midst of the Cold War, and in very short order into a very hot war under the aegis of a Cold War, Vietnam. And at the behest and prodding of Nancy Shea's book, my mother would do her part, and to a much lesser extent, so would my brother, sister, and me. Quick side note here, at the request of my sister, I am not an only child. That status had been lost with the arrival of my brother Scott in June of 1960 in Rhode Island, and just to drive the nail into the coffin was the arrival of my sister Mathan in September of 1963 in Maryland. Now that the record has been set straight, we can return to our story. In April of 1947, Bernard Baruch, a multimillionaire financier and advisor to presidents from Woodrow Wilson to Harry S. Truman, coined the term Cold War at the unveiling of his portrait in the South Carolina House of Representatives, where he said, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War. Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success." And if it was not for his good friend Walter Lippmann, one of the day's most respected journalists, using the term Cold War in his New York Herald Tribune column, it may have been one of the many lost speeches harbored in the South Carolina Congressional Record. So far, my father's involvement in the Cold War was flying out of Quonset Point, Rhode Island on anti-submarine warfare ASW patrols and on 2-week cruises aboard the Lake Champlain flying ASW patrols, in search of lurking Soviet subs off the mid-Atlantic coast and the North Sea. This was a couple of thousand hours of flying the S-2F over the ocean at 50 feet while coordinating with the carrier, its helicopters, and its escorting destroyers to find and destroy any threatening underwater menace. And considering the Stoof's ultimate weapon was a nuclear depth charge, it was serious business. Following this, he would have a 3-year respite from the Cold War while in Pax River at test pilot school. But when my dad's 3-year stint at Pax River came to an end, he would be ordered to Virginia Beach, Virginia, to serve as the assistant navigator on the USS Randolph CVS-15 and his return to Cold War warrior status. The Randolph was one of the many Essex-class carriers that had been upgraded with an angled deck, hurricane bow, new island, and upgraded catapults to allow it into the jet age. Like many of those same improved carriers, it would lose its brief CVA badge and become a CVS carrier dedicated to anti-submarine warfare, ASW, and no more jets. Now, aircraft carriers tend to be named after major battles, land and sea, famous statesmen, former presidents, even stinging bees, so you are forgiven if you are at a loss as to who Randolph was. The boat was named after Peyton Randolph, who was the first president of the First Continental Congress and died of apoplexy, another term for a stroke, in 1775 at the ripe old age of 54. I had no idea who he was either, but he does have that portly air of success in his portrait. Furthermore, you are probably wondering why my dad had been assigned as an assistant navigator. After all, he had just been trained as a test pilot and they've thrown him back into the fleet. That's quite an investment to be tossed back into the fleet. However, unlike the Air Force, the Navy does not consider being a test pilot as a career path. The prevailing sentiment is to put the test pilot back into the fleet to pass on what they have learned, but more importantly, to put a critical eye on procedure and tactics that can be improved on with the aircraft available. I can't say what that pipeline looks like, but testing an aircraft and the tactical realities of the same aircraft in real-world operations were often mutually exclusive. But this is what the Navy had in mind. It was felt that there would be improvement by putting these divergent viewpoints in the same cockpit and ultimately recognize faults in the aircraft and/or tactics that can be fixed and improved before too many aircraft and their pilots were lost. In any case, our time in Lexington Park, adjacent to Pax River, was coming to an end, and our belongings were being packed into a Mayflower moving van. Me, my brother, my sister, and whatever cats we had at the time were being packed into our Chevy 2 station wagon, with my mom at the helm for a relatively short ride to Virginia Beach, Virginia. My dad had already left, his Corvette not weighed down by much. Navigating a ship at sea is an ancient skill, and until the advent of the satellite and global positioning systems, GPS, was much the same as it had been for thousands of years. The Randolph had the distinction of being the first boat in the Navy with the Navy's precursor to GPS, Navy Navigational Satellite System, also known as Transit, and my dad was the project officer for that system while on board. Transit had initially been developed for the accurate positioning of Polaris ballistic submarines, and thus the accuracy of their missiles. It would be further developed for the military and civilian use to reliably track the position of the ships it was installed on, and it would be used until 1991. So, from February of 1965 to July of 1966, that's all my dad did, or so I thought. After reviewing his flight logs for that period, it turns out he was a carrier on-board delivery driver, COD for short, for the Grumman C-1A trader that was attached to the Randolph. 262 hours and 78 traps worth of COD driving, not an insignificant amount for a year and a half on board. He lists those hours and traps on his resume, but not where or when those flights happened. One thing is obvious, he could not escape the S-2F or its brethren. The C-1A trader was a derivative of the S-2F and was developed when a plane larger and more capable than the TBM-3R COD was needed. The C-1A would double the payload of the TBM-3R and add 3 more passengers to the TBM's 5. The C-1 would eventually be replaced by the C-2 Greyhound, itself a derivative of the E-2 Hawkeye. The C-2 would both triple the payload and passenger capacity of the C-1. Only 87 of the C-1s were built and would be the last piston engine aircraft to serve on a carrier when they were retired in 1988. The ASW Medcruiser was a relatively new assignment for Navy carriers. Not until 1958, in the aftermath of the U.S. Lebanon intervention, did the Soviets begin to extend the deployment of their 5th Escadra in the Med that included submarines. The 5th Escadra was an extension of their Baltic fleet, and the free and unhindered access to the Med through the Bosphorus Strait was severely curtailed by the Montreux restrictions that gave control of the straits to the Turks. These restrictions to that access made it difficult for the Soviets to easily access the Med, but despite that, the Soviets did their best to keep a presence on the Med. To that end, other than the Randolph making ports of call from June 11th through the 2nd of September 1965, it also carried out ASW patrols to keep tabs on any submarine that may be lurking beneath the water as a member of anti-submarine carrier Air Group 58, notably the Soviet kind. While my dad did his part to make this happen, my brother, mother, and I had left Norfolk, Virginia, leaving my sister behind aboard the Italian coal ship, the Simonetta, for a 2-week crossing of the Atlantic that ended in the Italian port of Genoa. Here my mom rented a white Fiat 1500 that would take us throughout Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and back to Genoa for our 2-week sojourner, returning us to Norfolk. I was only 6.5 years old for this escapade, so my memories are spotty. But certain things do stand out, the Paris Air Show being one of them. The Paris Air Show, with a much more interesting name in French that I won't even try to pronounce, and the Farnborough Air Show west of London are the 2 major international air shows that showcase the aviation industry, civilian and military alike. They are a collection of static displays and flight demonstrations. For 2 little boys, it was both boring and exhilarating. I'm not even sure my father was there, but what stands out, even today, were the 2 different approaches to the static displays. The Western military displays were like visiting a fussy grandmother who had her furniture covered in plastic and looked at you as one giant potential stain. The Eastern Bloc, particularly the Soviets, were like the wacky relative that let you play with everything and couldn't be happier that you were there. Several times, my brother and I were swept up by the Soviet pilots, taken into the cockpit, sat in their laps, and laid to waste any switch we liked, and best of all, we were given pins of that aircraft to celebrate our short visit. Except for one, I still have those pins, and in a bit of kismet, one of the aircraft I was swept into, the Tupolev 154, would fly me into the heart of the evil empire 13 years later when I visited Leningrad and Moscow. I'm not sure if what Nancy Shea had in mind when she wrote The Navy Wife was my mom, my brother, and I tagging along with my dad to Europe, but that's what we did. My dad was shadowing Soviet subs as they shadowed his carrier with suspicious, wary eyes and ears, wondering who was going to make the first move with little trust and understanding either side. My brother and I, on the other hand, were introduced to the Russian side of the Soviet, the gregarious, family-loving lot who just as soon raise a toast to life than to take it. I would meet them again 13 years later. But that's a different vacation, and our European tour for now is over. So, until next time, when we look at what might have been had NASA come knocking, thanks for joining me for the 7th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.